I'm actually going to pick up where Ryan left off. We're going to be talking about the third tithe blessing. And for some context, Ryan referenced the sermonette back in 2023 entitled, "When is the Third Tithe Year?" And that message showed that in Israel, the whole nation kept the third tithe year in common. The third tithe was based on the 7-year sabbatical cycle. And because God has preserved knowledge of that 7-year cycle, it is therefore possible for the church to keep the third tithe year together. That sermonette I subtitled Food for Thought. And maybe you can think of this message as Food for Thought Part 2. And the reason we're approaching it this way is that while the New Testament upholds tithing in general, it says hardly anything about its administration and nothing directly about the third tithe. And so what I said before and what I will present today is not any sort of policy. When you keep the third tithe is between you and God. Richard had mentioned previously that those who were recently baptized could have aligned their third tithe with the 7-year cycle, and then they wouldn't have to change anything. But nobody was or is requiring that. For those who have set aside the third tithe this year, the year is drawing to a close. And so we will be reviewing God's instructions for the end of this particular year, this agricultural year. And so please turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 14. Deuteronomy 14, we'll start in verse 28. It says, "At the end of every third year, you shall bring out the tithe of your produce of that year and store it up within your gates. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who are within your gates may come and eat and be satisfied, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands which you do." Now the placement here is significant because it comes just before the instructions for the year of release that we read in chapter 15. It's separated only by the translator's insertion of a chapter break. And this means that the third year is mentioned first in the context of the sabbatical cycle, which was already outlined in Exodus and Leviticus. And so if we were to read the two passages without the chapter break, first we'd read the instructions for the third year and then the instructions for the 7th year. So there's a linkage within the context. Now notice also that in verse 28, the word every is in italics, which means it's not in the original. Young's literal translation renders it simply, "at the end of 3 years." Now that sounds a little bit different to our English words, to our English ears, than what it meant to the Hebrews. The phrase "at the end of 3 years" doesn't mean after the third year, but rather it means within the third year. The third year is the end of the span of time. The third year is the end of 3 years. And so these instructions were to take place throughout the third year. Both verses mention your gates. And gates, it's not incorrect, but most translations instead use your towns, your villages, or your settlements. In other words, the gates are symbolic of the border of the community, and thus the community itself, rather than, say, a family's property in this context. In application, these instructions indicate that each family would set aside the third tithe in whatever storage they had, and from which they would then distribute the third tithe. But there was also a common storehouse within the community into which all the tithes for those in need would be gathered. And so for us, it could indicate that all of what has been set aside for third tithe should be out of our personal possession by the end of the third tithe year. But it could still be stored, as it were, in a community store, such as the church or a church program that is dedicated specifically to this. But our individual responsibility then would be fulfilled. And I will hasten quickly to add, again, this isn't policy, but it is one way to understand these instructions. It's also worth noting some of the similarities between the third tithe and the year of release. As Ryan mentioned, everything that grew by itself within the 7th year was designated for the poor, and all the debts were released, as well as the bond servants. And the third tithe was also for those within need. And so both ordinances were part of God's safety net so that there was not destitution within his land. And now we'll go to the only other place where God gives specific instructions for this tithe. This is Deuteronomy chapter 26. Please turn there. Deuteronomy 26, verse 12. When you have finished laying aside all of the tithe of your increase in the 3rd year, the year of tithing, and have given it to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, so that they may eat within your gates and be filled. And we'll stop there for now. Now the wording is slightly different here, but it's talking about the same tithe. And this time God calls the designated time the 3rd year, the year of tithing. If you look in an interlinear, you'll see that the definite article is found before the word third, which means it's talking about a specific 3rd year. In fact, there are actually 2 definite articles here. The Hebrew literally says the 3rd year. And it's mentioned the same way for the sabbatical year. In the Hebrew, it says the 7th year. It sounds really strange to us, but that's how they added emphasis. God gave the Israelites a common 3rd tithe schedule. Just like the weekly and annual Sabbaths and the year of release, the 3rd tithe was kept as a nation. Everybody shared in this experience of sacrificing to provide for those in need, just as God had the whole nation worship together on the holy days and do things like read Deuteronomy at the feast during the year of release. He wanted the nation to do those things at the same time as part of being in alignment with him. A shared experience within a community tends to draw people closer together, given that everyone has the right focus and attitude. And just to reiterate one more time, I'm not saying that it must be this way for the church, only that this is done what was done within Israel, and these are things for us to consider. We'll keep reading in verse 13 through 15. It says, "Then you shall say before the Lord your God, I have removed the holy tithe from my house, and also have given them to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, according to all your commandments which you have commanded me. I have not transgressed your commandments, nor have I forgotten them. I have not eaten any of it when in mourning, nor have I removed any of it for an unclean use, nor given any of it for the dead. I have obeyed the voice of the Lord my God, and have done according to all that you have commanded me." Verse 15, "Look down from your holy habitation, from heaven, and bless your people Israel and the land which you have given us, just as you swore to our fathers, a land flowing with milk and honey." Now the placement of these instructions is very significant. Remember that Deuteronomy means second law. It's a reiteration and an exposition of the laws stated throughout Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And it was written just before Israel entered the Promised Land. The laws are recounted as well as enhanced, beginning in chapter 12 and ending right here in chapter 26 with the 3rd tithe. This does not mean that these final instructions are an afterthought, but rather that they serve as almost a capstone of the second law, and we'll see why a bit later. The wording in verse 15 makes it clear that this isn't a blessing for individuals who set aside the 3rd tithe, but a blessing on the whole nation when the individuals are faithful. Notice it doesn't say, "Bless me," but rather, "Bless your people." The 3rd tithe was for the benefit of the poor of the nation, and when it was carried out, the whole nation would be blessed. There was an individual aspect to the third tithe in terms of personal responsibility, even to the point that the individual had to testify to God that he had been faithful when asking for this blessing. And yet both the timing of the third tithe and the blessing itself were national in scope. The third tithe is like the grain offering in at least one respect. If you remember, the grain offering signifies dedication to one's fellow man, or it's what one owes to his fellow man. However, that dedication to fellow man is itself an offering to God. And the third tithe is similar. While those in need are the recipients of the third tithe is really an act of worship toward God. And we get a glimpse of this in the fact that at the end of the third tithe year, the individual must report to God, not to a person, not to the priest. The third tithe is done in reference to God, even though it is given to other people. Verses 12 and 13 here indicates that this declaration only applies after the third tithe has been, it says, removed from the house. Part of this declaration was to affirm that the individual had not kept any of it back, that he had dispersed the entirety of the third tithe, whether directly to those in need or to the storehouse that was within the gates of the community. God required that this tithe be completely taken care of, one way or the other, before the individual could come before God and ask for this blessing. Verse 13 also specifies that this declaration was to be spoken. It says, before the Lord. This phrase, before the Lord, typically means that something is done in his presence or in the vicinity of the tabernacle or temple, the center of worship. It can also signify an approach of acting with God in mind or in reference to him as a form of reverence or dedication. Now, it does not specify this, but it could indicate that this declaration was to be given after the third tithe had ended at the Day of Atonement, and then everyone made their pilgrimage to the Feast of Tabernacles in the place where God placed his name. The people would then be as much before the Lord as they could. And this is the sense in which it's used earlier in this chapter in the first fruits declaration at Pentecost. And Pentecost was another pilgrimage festival where everyone gathered where God placed his name. Even so, we shouldn't be overly concerned about the location here. In reality, we are always before the Lord. The larger issue is that regardless of location, this is spoken with God at the forefront of our minds. For us, it means that it is spoken in spirit and in truth. And so still in verse 13, the person makes a solemn pronouncement before the Lord that nothing had been secretly reserved for personal use, but that he had faithfully discharged his duty completely. Now notice that it says, according to all your commandments which you have commanded me. There's a question as to which commandments are in view here. There really are not other commandments regarding the third tithe. It's only mentioned directly in these two places that we've seen. And so it's not clear why it says, according to all your commandments which you have commanded me. One possibility is that even though the third tithe is only specified in these two places, the commandments within this context could refer to all the other commands by God to support those in need or support the vulnerable. This would include the year of release, the commands not to glean the corners of the fields, not charging interest to a brother, not afflicting the widow or the fatherless, and so on. There are numerous laws that God gave that cover watching out for those who are disadvantaged in some way. And thus the individual would affirm that he had not only set aside the third tithe faithfully, but that he had also been faithful in all the other instructions that relates to helping those in challenging circumstances. There's a strong counterexample of this in Matthew 23, where Christ pronounces 8 woes on the scribes and the Pharisees for their hypocrisy. And in particular, he condemns them for devouring widows' houses, but trying to cover it up with long and pious prayers. The Pharisees may have been precise in setting aside the third tithe, and yet they missed the intent of God's laws by oppressing the weakest of society. We know the Pharisees tithed, even to the point of tithing on the smallest of herbs. And Christ upholds that. He says carefulness should not be left undone. But he also points out that the Pharisees were overlooking things that were even more important, such as justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And justice there indicates the impartial and the fair administration of God's standards. It means that judgment is righteous and not merely legally correct and yet ultimately unfair. The Pharisees may have been within their legal rights in taking the house of a widow, but it was not a just act to do so. It wasn't merciful, nor was it faithful to the intent of God's law. And so the Pharisees could not truthfully declare that they had acted according to all of God's commandments. And in this, we can start to understand why the third tithe instructions were placed at the very end of the second law. They serve as a representation of many of the laws governing how the citizens of the nation should treat each other, especially those who are least able to stand up for themselves. In this declaration, God links the third tithe with all his commandments. It's a year-long act toward him that benefits fellow man. It's a perfect application of the 2 great commandments that encapsulate our love toward God and each other. And so that gives us a way to understand the statement about giving the third tithe according to all God's commandments, which he had commanded them. However, the implications expand out even further because of what comes next. The next part of the declaration says, I have not transgressed your commandments, nor have I forgotten them. Now, it's possible that this is just a reiteration, and that the commandments that are in view here are, again, all the laws that have to do with taking care of those who need help. Yet even if this is just a reiteration, such a repetition shows its importance to God. Even so, most translations, except the New King James, add in the word any in this sentence in at least one place and some in 2 places. For example, the ESV says, I have not transgressed any of your commandments, nor have I forgotten them. And the Lexham English Bible renders this, I have not transgressed any of your commandments, and I have not forgotten any of them. And those renderings link the practice of the third tithe to the keeping of the entirety of God's commandments. And this is similar to what James says in James 2:10, that if we stumble in one point of the law, we're actually guilty of the whole law. This declaration seems to be along those lines. And what this means is that if an individual was neglectful or lackadaisical in his other duties to God and to man by ignoring laws he didn't want to keep, he could not then make this declaration before God and ask God for a blessing. God is showing that his people cannot separate out the various laws, choosing some and skipping others. Now, this does not mean that God expected sinlessness for a whole year, certainly not from Israelites. And yet making this declaration meant that they would have to evaluate themselves at the end of this year in relation to keeping his commands. Perhaps knowing that they would have to make this solemn declaration would keep them from some of the more egregious sins. If the people tried to straddle the fence by worshiping Baal but also paying lip service to the God of their fathers, God certainly would not honor this request for a blessing on the nation. And likewise, if we're working late on Friday or going to games on the Sabbath or committing fraud or whatever it happens to be, God's probably not going to look favorably on our request for a blessing, even if we have tithed faithfully. We can't compartmentalize our lives or cherry pick his law. Galatians 5:14 tells us, "For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Sacrifice is the essence of love, and the third tithe is a sacrifice because it stretches us financially for a whole year. And thus the third tithe is a year-long demonstration of love toward God and man. And yet this example of love also teaches that for God to accept it, we cannot neglect his other commands. God ties them all together. Now, before going on to the next verse, it's worth noting that under God's system, caring for the poor is not an act of penance for sin. In Catholicism, as a counterexample, almsgiving is sometimes done as a way to atone for sin or to seek spiritual renewal. In the Catholic sacrament of reconciliation, a priest may assign acts of charity, such as giving to the poor, to help the penitent person make amends for his sins. But God's way is entirely different. First, there is only one way by which sin can be atoned, and that's through the perfect sacrifice of the Son of God, which we will observe later this week. Nothing we do can ever atone for sin. And this is part of the reason that the Day of Atonement is a day without work. And second, in God's system, taking care of those in need is not something that is added on as an option. It's simply our duty to fellow man as part of our duty to God. It's not any sort of extra credit or way to earn favor either with God or with man. Now the next part of this declaration says, this is verse 14, "I've not eaten any of it when in mourning, nor have I removed any of it for an unclean use, nor given any of it for the dead. I have obeyed the voice of the Lord my God, and have done according to all that you have commanded me." So this section specifies some improper use of the third tithe. The three given here had physical applications as they applied to Israel, but we can find additional spiritual applications for us. Israel, as we understand, was an agrarian society, and so agriculture was their currency. The third tithe that was set aside was edible. Our society is quite different, with very few having tithes that can be eaten. And so we have to update the application to what we produce that we can set aside for those in need. But this explains why it mentions eating the tithe. They were setting aside agricultural products, and there was always the temptation to dip into that food storage in the event of some catastrophe, such as a death, when the household would be in mourning. In addition, the contact with a dead body would cause one to be ceremonially unclean. And remember that verse 13 specifically calls this tithe holy. It was dedicated to God, and so to deal with it while unclean would defile what had been designated as belonging to God. Now we can extend these principles for our circumstances. We have emergencies and catastrophes, even if they don't involve actual mourning. Our appliances break. Our cars need repairs, sometimes requiring a second mortgage. We may have an unexpected trip to the emergency room. We may find ourselves tempted in such circumstances to dip into the third tithe. But again, it's designated as holy. We are merely caretaking the tithe until we can give it away as our duty to God. And similarly, it says they could not remove any of it for an unclean use. And it could also be translated that they had not removed any of it while unclean. And this reiterates that even though it was within their personal stores, God still laid a claim on it and required that it be dealt with in a befitting manner. Under the new covenant, the greater concern is moral or spiritual impurity. In Mark 7 and verse 21, Jesus says that out of the heart proceeds things like evil thoughts, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, and pride. These are things that will defile us even more than touching a dead body. Now we can apply this to ourselves by looking into our hearts regarding how and why we are tithing. We can look for ulterior motives, like giving to certain people because of some gain that we might get in return, such as praise or acclaim. And likewise, even as God's love keeps no record of wrong deeds, so also God's love keeps no record of good deeds that might put someone in our debt in some way. If our giving has any sort of a string attached, or any motive other than pure devotion to God and fellow man, it is unclean. And this declaration is spoken before God, who is the discerner of the thoughts and intents of our hearts. As another possibility, perhaps we are tithing, but grudgingly. Maybe times are tough for us too, and it could be that our love for our hard-earned mammon, we love that more than we love that person in need. Whatever the case, it's possible for some spiritual defilement to enter in, and therefore this declaration requires an evaluation of our own purity regarding the third tithe. The last example of an improper use is giving any of it for the dead. This reference could be either to giving an offering from the holy tithe in honor of the dead, or it could refer to using the holy tithe in a funeral. Yet the things dedicated to God, as this tithe was, were to be used for supporting and sustaining life rather than anything regarding death, which was considered unclean. Now this injunction has another application for us, because Jesus teaches that the dead are those who have no spiritual life. This is seen most clearly in his instruction to let the dead bury the dead. Those without spiritual life could bury those without physical life. And this principle indicates that the third tithe is not just for anybody. It's intended for those who are of the household of faith, those who have spiritual life. And that doesn't mean that we can't help people outside the faith. We certainly can, and we understand we should. It just means that that help should not be from the holy tithe that is dedicated to God on behalf of the spiritual nation. The last part of verse 14 is another affirmation of faithfulness to all that God has commanded. As we're seeing, asking God for a blessing is dependent on one's entire walk with him, and not just faithfulness in this tithe. God keeps showing that he gave a package of laws that all work together to produce the fruit that he desires. But if we slack off in one area, it degrades what is produced. Now the request for a blessing comes in verse 15. Given that everything affirmed before it is true, the person says, "Look down from your holy habitation, from heaven, and bless your people, Israel." That looking down acknowledges God's superiority and how high he is above us. It also has a similar sense to Isaiah 66 in verse 2, which I'm going to borrow from Mark just for a moment. God says, "On this one I will look, on him who is poor and of a contrite spirit, and who trembles at my word." It means to look on him with favor, to have the Creator God, the Almighty, turn his attention. And that's what this request is doing. It's asking the God of the universe to turn his attention for the sake of bestowing favor on the nation as only he can. And again, this blessing is asked on the nation. This isn't to say that there aren't also individual blessings that come. There certainly are, and I believe anybody who has kept the third tithe, has experienced that. The budget for the year may look impossible, and yet the year works out in ways that we could not anticipate. We experience that we cannot outgive God. But in verse 15, it's unambiguous that the blessing is asked upon the nation. And this is where things really get interesting for us. Israel was a physical nation with land and boundaries, and the covenant God made with Israel primarily had to do with physical things. But the new covenant is founded on better promises and made with a spiritual nation. A core of the new covenant is that the way to God's throne is open to us, and we have access to spiritual gifts and to favor that the Israelites certainly did not. And so for those who are part of the spiritual nation, who make this declaration and ask for blessings, our sights should be much higher than just protection from physical adversaries or a bountiful physical harvest. Those are indeed blessings. Those are not wrong. But they are like asking for a Swiss-made watch when you could have asked for the entire watchmaking company. It's therefore worth considering how we would like God to bless this spiritual nation. In this regard, it's come to light in a number of conversations with ministers and other members within the greater church that none of the larger groups of the church are hurting for money, and neither are many, if not most, of the smaller groups. The greatest need right now in the church is not financial. We are in a time when the church, at least within the Israelitish nations, finds itself rich and increased with goods. It's interesting to contemplate this. In Daniel's prayer for repentance in Daniel 9, as the prophesied 70 years were coming to an end, Daniel asked God to shine his face, to cause his face to shine on his sanctuary, which was desolate. Daniel acknowledged that Judah still had not repented of the sins that resulted in scattering. And because the nation had not yet repented, they hadn't entreated God, or they had not wholeheartedly sought him, Daniel says that God had kept the disaster in mind. It means that the conditions that brought about the curse on Judah had not changed, and thus the nation was still under God's curse. They were still in exile, still scattered. And similarly, the spiritual nation is also still scattered, with another significant organization forming just a few years ago as a result of COVID. The fracturing is continuing. Some will say that it's all the failure of the ministry, and yet this overlooks the fact that leaders are usually cut from the same cloth as the people that they lead. And even worse, little to no thought is given to what God has been doing in the last 30 to 40 years, whether he is passively observing and wringing his hands, I speak as a fool, or whether he is actively governing the spiritual nation and even reorganizing it to get us to see him more clearly. And thus, God's spiritual sanctuary, while not entirely desolate, is still in disgraced circumstances, with a poor witness of God being made to the world. And yet there is no widespread acknowledgement that something must be amiss between the spiritual nation and our God for us to be within this condition. And so if you're coming to the end of your third tithe and are wondering what blessing to ask for, consider asking for God's favor on our spiritual nation in healing this breach with him. Consider asking that we may be first willing and then able to anoint our eyes and recognize our true need. Consider asking that we would be willing to buy the gold refined in the fire and the white garments, the things of immense spiritual value that may come at great personal cost. Consider asking for God to intervene and ask with mercy and bring us back to him in whatever way that we've gone astray. In Christ's final prayer in John 17, his appeal to the Father contained a five-fold request that his disciples, including us today, would join in the oneness that the Father and the Son share. And if we are one with them, it means that we will likewise be one with each other. That is utterly impossible for us to accomplish on our own, which is why the head of the church had to ask for it. It requires an act of God to be one. But it's hard to imagine a better blessing to ask for. So, ask big.